So, hello everyone, and welcome to this session. It's really great to be here on this global live stream. So, today I'm going to be speaking about a topic that is very close to my heart, and it's increasingly vital for HR professionals everywhere around the world. Um, Oops, sorry. It's moved across. So the topic today is about turning HR data into strategic insights. So, my name is Felicia Squire, and I work as a global HR director for an entertainment company, which is Wellbrain. I've worked in HR for over 20 years. I've worked across different sectors, from retail to FMCG, not-for-profit, government, and tech. I've held a variety of roles from talent acquisition, organizational development, change and transformation, and HR operations. So I'll be guiding us through the next around 60 minutes as we explore how we can move beyond spreadsheets and reports into meaningful stories, decisions, and real business impact. So just a bit of housekeeping, as Angeli said, we'll be using the chat throughout this. So I'm trying to make this as interactive as possible. So I'd encourage you to participate in the chat conversation because I would love to hear from you, your experience, and what you have to say about data. So look forward to hearing from you all. So you may be wondering how my background is related to HR data. Well, when I started my career in HR,
Felicia, sorry to interrupt you. The presentation is not in the presentation mode. So we are able to see
oh,
your notes as well, point and
okay.
sign.
Okay, bear with me.
Yeah. Yes, perfect. Perfect. So, Felicia, you're on mute.
Thank you, Anjali.
Yes, yes, thank you. Okay,
Um,
great.
Perfect. So let's start again. So you may be wondering how my background is related to HR data. So when I started my career in HR, I learned very early on about the importance of data. So I was very excitable. You can imagine a young 20-year-old entering the workplace, and I was always badgering my managers and stakeholders to implement the latest HR fad. However, it became clear to me quite quickly that when it came to HR, leaders really wanted to know tangible results. They wanted numbers and they weren't interested in any of the fluffy stuff that HR can normally fall victim to. So from that experience, I started to use data to look at trends, use data to create solutions and measure outcomes. I found that data was the thing that gave me and the HR teams credibility. I've put this quote here that without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And I really love this quote because I found that without meaningful data, we can just be seen as another person with an opinion. And now more than ever, the stakes are just too high for that to happen. So in every organization, different departments from finance to marketing to sales use data, and they use data to really drive business decisions. So HR is just as important, HR data is just as important, which we'll dig into a bit more in this webinar. So just to get us a little bit warmed up, I would love to hear from you of how comfortable you are with HR data. And when I say comfortable with HR data, I'm not talking about collecting and presenting basic HR data, but really about how comfortable you are using it with advanced analysis. So if you just put that in the chat, that would be great.
Felicia, I guess your slide is stuck. Are you on the first slide?
I'm on the chat that's got the quote.
Without data, you are just
Yeah,
another person. Yeah, okay,
yeah.
okay, okay, okay. Okay. So do you want me to play the poll for everyone?
No, just people can put it in the chat, that's fine.
Okay.
So if you're able to just share how comfortable you are using HR data. And if you're not from a HR background, then just data in general is fine. One, okay, 3/5, okay. Okay, so a bit of a mixture. Okay, perfect. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for your insights there. So today we'll be covering quite a bit. So I'll be walking us through the business case for HR. So looking at why HR data is important now more than ever. We'll then be looking at some of the core data as HR teams should be using and the strategic impact of this data. We'll then look at how to transform this data into actionable insights, and then we'll finish off by working through a case study. I'll give some tips of how to gain buy-in from the business to invest in HR data, as this can sometimes be the biggest stumbling block. And we'll close by having a Q&A session. Um, Again, I'd love to hear from you and how you're currently using either HR data or data within your organization. So if you can put that in the chat, that would be great. Okay. So why now? Why the drive for HR analytics now? To be honest, it's been like this for a number of years, but more and more workplaces are becoming much more complex, from hybrid work, multi-generational and global teams, gig workers, changing employee expectations. People now expect so much more from their employers than previously, which means that HR needs data to truly understand and manage people effectively. Data helps us to navigate this complexity and really to tailor strategies to diverse employee needs. Business leaders are demanding impact, so HR is no longer just about policies and compliance, and it hasn't been for a number of years, but is expected to deliver measurable outcomes with data. We move from intuition, so that whole gut feel, to real influence, putting HR at the forefront of driving performance and growth. Talent continues to be a top risk and opportunity. With skill shortages, high turnover, and evolving job roles, organizations must use data to forecast talent needs, reduce attrition, and develop future capabilities. Data gives us real early warning signs and insights into, do we build talent, do we buy talent, or do we borrow the skills that we need? So AI and automation, so HR technology is becoming much smarter. However, its effectiveness really depends on accurate and up-to-date people data. Poor data equals poor insights, which equals poor decisions. And if we really want to see it at the table, our secret weapon really is data. Because business data is because HR people data is business data. I always say that it's just as important as customer data because there's lots of research that shows that there's a clear correlation between engagement and customer satisfaction. And we know that customer satisfaction impacts a business's bottom line, therefore showing that HR data is important. Employee expectations are evolving, as I've said. People want personalized, they want fair, and they want transparent experiences. Data helps us to listen better, and not just listen better, but to act faster. We can't asking people for their opinions through employee engagement surveys and not acting in a prompt way. So driving the employee experience forward with data is vital. Compliance and ESG pressure. So, from pay gap reporting to sustainability and ethical labor practices, organizations must show evidence of this. So, HR data enables real-time reporting and real trust. So, for a number of years, HR has evolved really from an administrative function to a strategic and influential role that aligns with business goals and focuses on employee engagement, talent management, and organizational culture. Now, leaders want more from HR. They're demanding a connected, a digitally enabled, and analytics-led function supporting the business's wider aims. It's very clear that data literacy and the ability to use data to make strategic decisions is a skill set that HR needs to possess. It needs to continue to develop. However, I asked a question earlier. Research in the UK has shown that only 6% of HR professionals are using advanced analytical techniques to help make business decisions. Just over one fifth, so about 21% of HR professionals are confident conducting advanced analytics, while 37% use very basic HR data. So I'm going to have a little bit of a poll. So I'd love to hear what your biggest data challenge is at the moment. So there should be a poll come up. Okay. So somewhat data driven. That's so a real mix. Somewhat data driven. Then we have not data driven, and very data driven. So a nice mix. A mix there. Mix there. Okay, so you may already know this, but just to reiterate, there are four types of HR data that you should know. So there's the descriptive. So this tells you the what. So what happened? So turnover, for example, in the last quarter was at 28%. Then we have diagnostic data. This uncovers why it happened. So my mouse is just moving itself. Sorry about that. So diagnostic looks at why it happened. So using things like exit interviews shows that of the 28% of people left because they felt stuck in their roles and they were feeling overworked. Then we have predictive data. This focuses on what the forecast of what might happen next. So we're seeing that, for example, we're seeing that employees under 30 with less than a year's service are likely to leave. And then that leaves us with prescriptive. So this tells us what to do about it. So we've seen the what, we know the why, we know what may happen in the future. So what are we going to do? So in this example, let's launch an internal careers program and shorten shift lengths. So most, if not all, HR teams have this data, but what's important is not just what the data is showing, but how you'll use it to drive decisions. So sorry, guys, I did say this was going to be interactive. So if you turn against the chat, please share with me if you can share what's the most underutilized data point in your organization. Would you say is descriptive, diagnostic, predictive, or prescriptive? Which of these four data points would you say is the least used in your organization? If you can just drop it in the chat. Okay, predictive. Okay, predictive again. So we've got quite a few predictive, descriptive. Okay. Okay, perfect. So um clear that quite a lot of the gaps mainly in the predictive type of data, with some being descriptive and some being prescriptive. Perfect, thank you. So we're going to move on to a case study. So let's take a real life example. So we have a manufacturing business, and they are struggling with high turnover rate. So the descriptive data, the what, shows us that in the past 12 months, 28% of employees left the organization. So the diagnostic data, so the why, the exit interview shows people feel overworked due to long shift patterns, and people felt they had limited development opportunities. We looked at scheduling data, which showed that they were back-to-back shifts, which further validated the exit interview data. It is, however, really important to not just look at one data source, to look at multiple data sources, especially data sources not always in HR. So I've worked in an organization, for example, where leaders felt that people leaving the organization due to pay and pay alone. And they were really adamant and really keen to increase everybody's salary and really give them a quite a significant increase. However, this led the HR team to really look at the to benchmark our roles. And when we saw our compa ratio was between 106 to 120%. So that gut instinct of that leader, due to a few people's comments, could have cost the business significant amount. So it further highlighting the real importance of using data. But what it did do, it did prompt the team to do benchmarking, and it did prompt the team to have that as a data point in the analytics and data that was shared with the business. So going back to the case study, so in this particular example, the predictive data showed that shift workers aged between 20 and 30 with less than a year's service were most likely at risk. So what did they do? They took action, which was shortening shift lengths, increasing break time, and offering more development opportunities so people could progress within the organization. And what was the result? So the result was a drop in turnover, business saves money, and HR is now part of the solution. It is definitely a key point to note, however, that this type of change takes time. For this organization, it took about 6 months to see the impact of the changes to their working practices. But what was important is the communication and the transparency that HR had during this change process. So HR data tells the story. However, insights enables a greater understanding of the why, which really can influence decisions. I'm gonna just put through a poll. So got a quick question for you. So what would you say is your biggest data challenge right now? Okay. Okay. So it's diff linking data to business outcomes seems to be the big one. Okay. So I'm going to end the poll and I'll share the results so you can see that the biggest challenge for data right now is difficulty linking data to business outcomes, which is something that's shared through many organizations, many HR teams. Okay, so now let's talk about the metrics that matter and how we can move from reporting to real insights and how we can really answer that those business outcomes. So most HR functions track things like turnover, absenteeism, time to hire. But if we just shift our mindset slightly and look at that, each of these things that we track is actually a clue. And if we link them to the right business question, they become powerful tools for change. So I'm going to just walk through some examples. So if we look at turnover rate, for example, it's not just a number, it can reflect issues with culture, with leadership, with compensation, or career development, as we saw in the previous example. Things like time to hire, are we losing candidates because our processes are too slow? Is there a talent pipeline issue? So many teams collect this data, but I personally also feel that the quality of hire is just as, if not more important than the time to hire metric. So how are our new hires performing? This can tell us if we need to make changes in our hiring processes. And then things like absenteeism, this could be an early sign of burnout, disengagement, or poor management. So too often we use TISM as a way to implement policy. So for example, employee X has triggered the sickness policy, which yes, we should do, but how about we also look at the data deeper? So rather than just looking at absence data for things like policy administration, looking to see are there any trends in people going off sick? Is there a bigger issue? So do we see that a certain gender or certain age group or certain demographic have high levels of absence? Is there a management or cultural issue? This will help us to move from just using absence as an admin and compliance task to really providing greater insight. And then diversity ratios. So if we're not attracting or promoting diverse talent, what messages are we sending to the business? Things like internal mobility, are people growing? If not, they'll leave to do it elsewhere, which will impact turnover. And then engagement scores, looking to see how connected and valued and motivated people feel. If we combine two or three of these, we can start to see patterns and start to predict outcomes. So connecting metrics to business problems. So that's one of the things that was highlighted one of the biggest challenges. So if you imagine this, engagement is low in a particular business unit. You also notice high absenteeism, low internal mobility, and longer time to hire. What's the story? That business unit could have a leadership gap, low morale, a broken career path. That's the insight, and that's the kind of story that the business wants to hear. So, I'd love to hear from you. So if you just stick in the chat, what would you say is the metrics that you use most often in the organization? Is it retention? Is it absenteeism? What metric are you mostly using? If you just put that in the chat. Retention, turnover. Perfect. So we've got retention, we've got time to hire. Time to hire is a great one. But also I think the quality of the hire is also is a great one because you can see if there's any gaps in your processes, diversity, retention, all of them. Perfect. Thank you. So this is a typical dashboard that many HR teams use to show people data. It's a great executive summary of data. But I think we need to go a bit deeper to make the data even better. So we should include things like trends. So instead of using single numbers, can we look at trends? How do we compare year on year, month on month, quarter by quarter? I would also encourage you to use similar language with the business. So if the business does reporting month on month, then our HR data should reflect that as well. If our business does year on year or quarter by quarter, then let's align as much to the business as possible in the way that we demonstrate and visualize our data. Visualize any hotspots. So is there any areas of concern, any areas where there's a risk? Really visualizing that. And then also including actions alongside metrics. So yes, we can see there's high turnover. Is there low turnover? Is there high engagement, low engagement? What action are we taking? So that last point is really key. So with data, there should be action that follows. So if we're collecting data, what action are we doing to either improve, maintain, or further develop? So how do we do that? So how can we really turn data into actionable insights? So data by itself can actually be very overwhelming, especially if you have big data. So our job is to really make it meaningful. So if we think about it this way, so the context, so people leaving, high absence rates, engagement, for example, plus comparison. So how are we comparing to the previous year? How are we comparing to other organizations? How are we comparing to industry best benchmark? And then plus visualizing that. So how can we visualize that to make it visually appealing for business to really understand? And that brings a lot more clarity. So when we put the numbers into a narrative, when we show why it matters, that is what it means and what could happen next. That's when people start to listen. So rather than just having turnover 28%, absenteeism this percentage, but actually what does it mean? And there was some data challenges in terms of business outcomes, which I'll talk about a bit later on. But if we can show that turnover is at 28% and is impacted revenue in this particular area, then that's showing the business outcomes. So what has been the outcome of the high turnover rates to the business? So there's a data to action framework that I love to use, and it's a four-step framework. And the first one is collect. So making sure that you have clean, consistent, and reliable data. So I've fallen victim of this a few times, especially when using manual systems, but making sure you have clean and consistent and reliable data. Without that clean and reliable data, it can just really destroy credibility and trust in an instance. So making sure that the data you have is clean, is consistent, and is reliable. So if you report it one way in a particular month, just keep it consistent, is what I'd recommend. Connect, so linking people data to business outcomes. So, like I said earlier, not just saying turnover is high, but so turnover is high and sales dropped in regions with the highest turnover, and then the business community, the connection between and why we need to do something about it. So convert, so translate data into a business question or decision, and then communicate. So use visuals and stories to share it with leaders who may not always be data experts. This is how we shift from just reporting to really being a decision making partner. I s So how do we actually take actionable steps now that we have the data? So it's important to set goals, making them, I'm sure we've all heard this of SMART, but defining what the goals are, making sure they're measurable, making them specific, and aligning them to business priorities. So if the goal does not align with the business priorities, just don't even bother setting it. And I say that because, like I said earlier, there's so much more demand on people, on HR teams. Is expecting a lot more from us. So to set goals that are not aligned with business objectives is just taking away valuable time that you can be doing to add value elsewhere. So, I would say to implement the strategies. So once you've set the goals, implement strategies. So take action based on data insights and then measure results, adjusting and continually reviewing. I've seen so many times when we've said, right, we've fixed this problem now, tick box, let's move on to the next. Actually, no, let's continue to measure, let's continue to review and could adjust because what worked this year no longer work. So yes, we may have a program, but is it still relevant? Making sure whatever we have in place is solving a problem. It's not just there because it's a nice to have, not just having the latest HR fad, but actually is what the business needs. So let's bring this to life a little bit with a few strategic use cases. So these are based on real examples that I've seen work. So if we look at predicting attrition, so there's a global company, they use predictive analytics to flag which employees were most at risk of leaving based on their tenure, based on engagement, and based on manager changes. From this data, sorry, retention interviews, and they fast-tracked development plans. And the result that they saw was a 12% drop in regrettable leavers. So showing that using predictive analytics was able to enable them to dig deeper, do some diagnostic work, and really create a program that would solve a problem because they're on the front foot of it. I've also seen this in recruitment. So I've seen in some particular roles, let's call it, I'm going to just make this roll up, customer service assistant, for example, in an organization I've worked in. People in that role tend to stay for 2 years and no more than 2 years because there's not much career progression. You can learn the job in a year, and there's not much more development. Yes, some people can elevate, but actually the progression routes are quite low. So rather than and so what we saw happen is that recruitment became slow. Everyone was like frustrated in terms of why the process being so slow, frustrated, having gaps in having people there. But actually, if we just looked at the data was clear. People leave the business after about 2 years. So it allowed them to be a lot more proactive with their recruitment. It allowed them to develop a real talent pipeline So when they're recruiting, so for example, if somebody's coming up to 1 year, 10 months, then we start looking at that, building that talent pipeline and reaching out to candidates, keeping candidates warm, really utilizing the network and not just waiting for somebody to resign because the data is clear that people are going to leave within 2 years. Most of the time, it had it. No, actually, 90% of the time it has proved to be very successful. There were some times when people have stayed on longer, but there actually is no harm in building that talent pipeline because it allows the business to be proactive and allows HR teams to react fast and really diminish and reduce time lost from somebody leaving. So fixing diversity gaps, another example. So one organization, they reviewed hiring and they reviewed that their hiring and promotion data by gender and race. So their data showed that despite having a diverse pool of employees, these employees were not being promoted. So what they did with that data is that they looked at the reasons why, and they found that it was from their leadership development pipeline. So what they did is that they redefined what that looked like. So this organization, they used the Talent Nine box grid, and however, they saw that in that process, it was filled with bias. So they adjusted the way they identify key talent, which led them to have a much more diverse management development pipeline. And this is how the data supports inclusion within the organization, in that particular organization. And then in terms of manager impact, so this is a this I've seen this in every organization I've worked in. Managers have been very strong technically and they're promoted into management roles without any real development and just kind of expected to know what to do with their people, which is something that I've seen time and time again and continues to happen. When we were fully in the office, let alone in the hybrid and remote world. So an organization, they ran employee engagement surveys and they sliced the data by team. And they found that there were certain managers who were thriving and those other managers who were struggling. So rather than just putting everyone through a blanket management development program, they were able to really tailor their manager training by offering best practice sharing between the more experienced managers and those new to management, really having management programs which identify the gaps that the employee engagement survey identified. So if we just turn to the chat, I'd love to hear from you in what one area in your organization, if cost, money, if nothing would hold you back, what would you say would be the one thing that your organization could do with data that could really drive some real change? If you can drop that in the chat, that would be great. So I realized that I was a bit all over the place with that question, but if there's one thing in your organization that data could really change, what would that be if cost wasn't an issue? Talent development and retention. Yeah. Retention rate could be improved. Yeah. For me, I would say it would be tools to you to do predictive and analytics. Promotions, that's a great one. Well-being, that's fantastic. Cross-skilling, yeah, that's really great. Well-being, yeah, yeah, these are great. Thank you. Keep them coming. Love to hear from you all. Cross-function learning, it's fantastic. Perfect. Succession planning, perfect. Thank you. So gaining buy-in. So, I mentioned it earlier, but one of the biggest blockers that I found is gaining buy-in to really invest in HR data, because if you, to get the system that can do all of this, it needs investment. So here are some things that I found work really well. So start small and focus on data you can trust. So as I mentioned earlier, making sure your data is clean and consistent. There is absolutely nothing worse than presenting data that is inaccurate. And I've experienced this, especially when I've used manual tools like Excel. So when I've worked in smaller organizations that had no HR system and all their data was in Excel, yes, it was tough. But yes, making sure you have data you can trust and presenting really clean, consistent data. And if you can't trust that data, focus on cleaning it up. I wouldn't say not to share it at all, but focus on really getting clean data and start small. Um, Make sure that so it's also without saying that we have a great responsibility to our employees to treat their data in an ethical way, ensuring that privacy and ensuring there's privacy with their data and really only using their data for legitimate aims. So that's just a given. So I mentioned that we lose credibility and trust from leaders if we have inaccurate data, but equally as important, we just cannot lose the trust of our people over their data. So we really need to make sure that we treat their data with the utmost privacy. I focus on data that is linked to business goals. So if the business goal is growth, for example, to grow a particular percentage year on year, then you can look at the headcount increases or reductions year on year. You can look at salary spend year on year. You can look at um, a lot of the HR data can actually relate to HR to business growth. So if, for example, the business hasn't achieved its growth targets and you've noticed and your data shows that turnover is high, engagement is low, then you can make that linkage very clearly. So yes, on the surface, it may look like HR data is difficult to align to business goals, but actually with every business goal and every business goal there are people behind it. So if there's a goal of growth, people are behind it to make that growth happen. If there's a goal of efficiency, there's data behind it in terms of what's our revenue per employee, for example. So using data that's really linked to business goals. I would say speak the language of the business, definitely speaking the language of the business. So if the business is focused on things like revenue or EBITDA when they present their data, making sure that our data also is aligned with that. So, for example, if our data shows that turnover is low and we have a diverse pool of employees in team A, and this in team A have EBITDA of this percent above other departments, then that's linking it to business language. That's using business terminology, so there's consistency across the board. And finally, I will show the cost of not having data. So you can ask this, for example, if you can ask the business, what would be the impact, what would be the cost of not having customer data? Similar to HR, if you don't have HR data, the impact is 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 just as significant. So without customer data, you can't get the insights to know who to target. Without employee data, you don't know how to develop your people. You haven't got clear ideas of where the gaps are. So it's just as important. I'm gonna do I'm going to ask a couple of questions now. I'd love to hear which HR metric you use most often. Um, not sure if you can see. Yeah, okay. Okay, great. So the two most used metrics are time to hire and employee turnover. So those are really great ones. Um, Anybody who does measure time to hire, which is fantastic. Also recommend cost of hire, so you can see your spend and you can track uh, and show improvements in your spend. If you use agencies, for example, you can show improvements in some of your spend. I was also look to see if you can include quality of hire, and that could be in terms of people passing their probation, if you have probation, what people's performance management scores are, 6 months to a year after joining. So that's another good indicator. Got almost there. I've got a couple more polls I'd love to get your insights on. Just one more actually. So the final question, which I'll come to in a minute, um, is we've covered quite a bit in the last 40 to 45 minutes. So here's a couple of things that I'd love for you to take away. So I often hear that we need more data, but actually I'll challenge that, and I don't think we actually need more data. I think we need to make better use of the data that we do have, and also we actually need better questions. So what is data telling us? What problem are we solving? Combine data points to create stories and not just statistics. So as I mentioned before, rather than just saying time to hire was X or turnover rate was X, but the so what? So turnover was X and what impact did that have on the business? So HR becomes really strategic when it connects people to business impacts and performance. And I would say the shift isn't necessarily from admin to analytics, but it's really about shifting from metrics to meaning. So what does the data, what does the metrics mean to the business? And people analytics is our power tool, so we should really use it and use it well. So I have one final poll with you for you today. So what would you say was one of the highlights that you'll be taking away from today's session? I'd love to hear from you.